Hi, and welcome back to a whole new season of Uncommon Sense from the Sociological Review Foundation. I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia, and I'm back for season 4 with my co-host Alexis Hutrong in Ottawa. And I reckon, Alexis, that we can call ourselves long-term co-hosts now. We've been working together for 4 years. And I mean, I haven't seen you since 2024. So how have you been since we last recorded our show on joy? Do you have any sociological New Year's resolutions that perhaps you've broken by now?
I'm doing good,